In both of the major presentations for this week in History 3551, I'm going to be making reference from time to time to Hansen. That would be Victor Davis Hansen, the author of Carnage and Culture, which is a book that I assigned in a previous iteration of the course that involved students having read Victor Davis Hansen. I'm not going to have you read Hansen this time, but I do want you to understand the so-called Hansen thesis and some related elements. So let me go ahead and get started with that. Let me share the screen with you. Okay. Here are the terms for this brief lecture that we're going to call the West versus the Rest, ? The terms, as you'll see, master narrative, Western Civ course, and so on. And I'm going to try to remember to always put these terms and the learning objectives up on Carmen so that you'll have them available to you as you work through the lectures. But if I ever forget to do this, first of all, send me an email and remind me and I'll add it. But in the meantime, what you can do is do a screenshot with your smartphone or whatever and get a hold of the terms that way. Okay. These are the learning objectives. By the end of this presentation, you should understand, first, what is meant by the term master narrative, also known as meta narrative or grand narrative. Secondly, the history and significance of the Western civilization course. Third, what is meant by Eurocentrism. Fourth, what is meant by Plato to NATO. Then know something, a very little bit, about the development of world history as an academic field. And then finally, the struggle to shift the field of military history from a Euro-American to a world history orientation. Now, this is the textbook that I used the first time that I taught a course on Western civilization. And I'd like you to look at the title, The Mainstream of Civilization. So right away, you've really got what would then have been a statement that would have just, or a proposition that would have just gone right over the heads of most of us. But embedded in it is the idea that Western civilization, European civilization, is the main corridor, the main conduit of all civilization. And that in some sense, African civilization, Asian civilization, and the various countries involved with that are somehow or other lesser forms of civilization. And this very much reflects the idea of Eurocentrism, which is to say a focus on European and by extension developments in European settler societies like the United States of America, like Canada, like Australia, and so on, as being the main focus of historical studies, or for that matter, literature or art, and so on. Eurocentrism means a focus on those things. And in terms of where this comes from, it originated, the idea of Western civilization courses originated in Columbia University in the beginning of the 20th century. The idea was that they felt like incoming students needed to have a common grounding in what they called contemporary civilization. And what we're looking at here is is Columbia University at that time. This is in New York City. And then this is what the original syllabus looked like on the right-hand side. And for decades, students took this course with no balking, with no getting upset about it, and so on. And then in the 1960s, there was a growing realization that in effect, what students were being exposed to was a kind of propaganda that said that European civilization and certain kinds of European values and certain kinds of literature and so forth were the kind of things that students were supposed to understand, and that this came at the expense of an understanding of the rest of the world. It came at the expense of an understanding of the contribution made by women in the world, because if you looked at literature, almost all of the books were written by men, and there were a variety of problems embedded in this concept of contemporary civilization. Read Western civilization. This disenchantment with this kind of really a limited framework of education carried over to Ohio State University. And in April and in May 1970, there's a tremendous student strike right here at Ohio State that involved the intervention of state highway patrolmen, the National Guard, local law enforcement, and so on. And so these are photographs taken from some of those demonstrations, which, by the way, at one point, there was an estimated 100,000 students or 100,000 people on the Oval as part of this protest. Many, if not most of them, students, but also students from other areas who had come to participate in the protests, and frankly, just people who thought something interesting was going on and wanted to be part of it. But out of this this ferment, you got the beginnings of women's studies here at Ohio State. You got the beginnings of African and African American studies here at the United States. You got an interest in broadening the study of history and of other fields to include to place things in a world context. And so one example of this was the creation of a historical society, the World Historical Association, which generated its own academic journal, the Journal of World History. And then right here at Ohio State, one of the first world history textbooks was created by two professors here in the Department of History at Ohio State, Carter Findley and John Rothney. They put together a course called 20th Century World. And at first they didn't have a textbook that they could use, so eventually they wrote their own. It was and remains in wide use for its topic. And this out of this ferment, really, you got just a variety of major figures, some historians, some political scientists, some sociologists, like Andre Gunder Frank, shown here at left, who wrote a number of books. He's a prolific writer, but one of his books was called Reorient, Global Economy in the Asian Age. And this was kind of a play on words. Orient used to mean East Asia, and the idea was let's reorient, let's refocus ourselves on Oriental developments, and particularly the Oriental or the East Asian influence on the world economy. And here is one of the maps that he uses in the book. And what it shows, these arrows, what they show is the direction of the flow of silver to pay for surplus goods or trade surplus. And so what you'll notice is all the silver, one way or another, as you trace where it goes to ultimately. It may begin in South America and make its way to Western Europe, but then it makes its way via various conduits to China, which suggests that China was the wealthiest civilization at that time, that it was the greatest sort of have society in terms of having the goods that the rest of the world coveted. luxury goods, but also advanced metallurgical goods, spices, um, all kinds of things that the rest of the world wanted to have, and that really up until about 1750 or so, if you were to look down uh, at at the earth and could look at all the different civilizations uh, on the earth at that particular time, and you had to point out the one that was the most advanced administratively, culturally, economically, and so on, you would have pointed to China without much hesitation. Nevertheless, in terms of military history, for a long time, military history remained very much um, operating within the frame of the European and American experience. And the rationale for this was that um, from that in modern times, beginning in circa 1500, and then coming on down to modern times, the the, mili- the military dominant civilization or societies were European societies and that of their American and Australian and Canadian offshoots. And so this repaid um, the the emphasis that was placed on the study um, of European military history. And so this book that's called the Cambridge Illustrated History of Warfare, edited by our own Jeffrey Parker, was in fact all about the European and American military experience, and unabashedly so. The subtitle, indeed, of the book was called The Triumph of the West. Now, to get into Victor Davis Hanson and Carnage and Culture, and we will mention Hanson and his so-called Hanson thesis at various points during the semester. We'll talk a little bit about the sort of the basic ideas that are embedded in Hanson's Carnage and Culture. First, and these ideas come under the rubric of the Hanson thesis. First, the Hanson thesis argues the existence of a distinctive Western way of war, and that this Western way of war accounts for European military dominance. Second, it argues that this Western way of war is based upon a distinctive set of cultural attitudes and preferences in the conduct of war. And then finally, it argues that this Western way of war is characterized by cultural continuity stretching back all the way to classical Greece. Now, here are the elements in this Western way of war. And bear in mind, from Hanson's standpoint, these will apply to all wars in which Europeans are involved, and by extension, all the ones that I'll be talking about in this course, whether I mention the Hanson thesis explicitly or not. And so here they are. The first is that he regards the Western way of war as being being characterized by political freedom, which is to say, in his view, European and their American offshoots frequently fight for the cause of political freedom, not just against an opponent, but they fight because of a sense of a political freedom on their own part that creates a connection between themselves and their parent society, so that Greeks felt had a sense of participation and a sense of freedom within their own society, and this meant that when their polis or their city state, the Greek city state to which they belonged, asked them to go to war, they would, because they felt a sense of connection. and a sense of participation with what their larger society was doing. Secondly, Hanson's argument was that in European warfare, you find a preference for decisive battle, for bringing a fight to the finish as soon as possible. Third, he says that Europeans are characterized by a preference for the use of citizen soldiers. So not just soldiers who are long-term soldiers who are essentially divorced from their populations and have no connection with their larger society, but rather soldiers who see themselves as being citizens, as being participants in that larger society. Then he has an emphasis that he places on what's called landed infantry. We don't need to go into that too much, but one element of it is his sense that what is dominant in the European way of war is as an emphasis on the use of ground soldiers, on the use of infantry. Something that's going to crop up in the course of actually this very week 2 of the course, is his emphasis on rationalism and the idea that that in cultural terms, Westerners have an ability that is superior to that of other societies, and I'm following Victor Davis Hanson here, to think not in terms of superstition or in terms of religion or any kind of thing that gets in the way of their looking at a particular situation in terms of sort of a cold-eyed logic and an ability to in a logical, rational kind of way to examine their own strengths relative to an opponent and to exploit the weaknesses of an enemy relative to their own strengths, their own advantages. Then capitalism is important in the Western way of war. Westerners are considered to be very good at mobilizing capital, mobilizing wealth, and being able to use it to purchase all of the things that are involved in making war, warships, to create armies, to create aircraft. One of the reasons that the United States can afford to rely upon these very expensive drones that are used for their standoff capability and their ability to take out enemy targets with little or no risk to human life is the ability of the United States to draw upon its wealth to afford drones and not to have to put boots on the ground in order to accomplish the same or similar objective. Western discipline is something we're also going to see explicitly down the line in this course. And this has to do with the predilection in the Western way of war for soldiers to fight in a highly disciplined way alongside one another and not to fight in terms of sort of a frenzied melee in which the prowess of the individual warrior is what counts more than anything. What counts more than anything in the Western way of war is to follow instructions and to carry out systematized tactical tactics in the pursuit of gaining victory on the battlefield. Then there is the idea of individualism, of creating scope for individuals to make decisions on the battlefield, and so rather than doing exactly what a king or an emperor or whatever tells them to do, even if it doesn't make common sense, the Western way of war creates space for generals to disobey those specific orders if their understanding what's going on the battlefield means that a different decision is the right rational decision to make, or it allows for room for initiative on the part of people farther down the ranks, including sergeants and privates, and so on. If an order that they're given doesn't make sense in the context of what they feel needs to be done, allowance is made for them to exercise their own individual initiative. And this is something that Hansen says differentiates the Western way of war from other ways of war. And then finally, self-critique. And that is to say, in the Western way of war, when a loss occurs, yes, the people who are responsible for the loss are held accountable for that loss, but there's also an ability for Western military institutions to take a step back and to figure out what they did wrong, and with a view toward fixing what went wrong, or if they can't fix it, to avoid getting in a situation where the same thing could go wrong again. And this ability to criticize oneself in the interest of doing better next time is also something that Hansen says is a hallmark of the Western way of war. Now, I will tell you right now that Hansen's thesis is controversial in a variety of ways. First, military historians don't necessarily see this kind of cultural continuity throughout military history, even within the Western way of war. Then there are some who think that this is a thinly veiled attempt to sort of shoehorn a Western chauvinism, a sense of Western superiority, into looking at military history. And there are a number of other criticisms that can be made of the Western way of war. Nevertheless, it's an important thesis, and whether you agree with it or not, it's important to know that it is out there. In any event, over time, once you begin to get the emergence of world history, you began to see the beginnings of world history textbooks to support courses in world history. This is one that I have in my library that I've used, and it took a while for military historians to create the same kind of textbook in terms of creating a world military history. And so here you see two examples. The one on the left, Warfare and World History by Michael Nyberg, came out in the 1990s, and it's basically about 100 pages long. It's really just a very short sort of introduction to what such a course what such a textbook might look like. And then World History of Warfare is a book that I used for a number of years in the past. For one thing, it's relatively inexpensive. That's an advantage to it. But a disadvantage to it is that that book is now the better part of 20 years old. And so cost isn't everything. What you really want is something that is up to date and represents kind of the state of the art in what world military history involves. And so there was an additional attempt along the lines called War in World History, but the book that we're going to be working off of is Wayne Lee's Waging War. That's Wayne on the left. Teaches at the University of North Carolina. Just a tremendous military historian, also a very nice guy. And notice the subtitle of Waging War: Conflict, Culture, and Innovation in World History. Those are culture. The center term is very much at the heart of what he's looking at in terms of the themes that one of the themes that he uses in Waging War in order to make the whole compass of this military history textbook manageable. And then innovation. And by innovation, he means a variety of things, but technological innovation is one of them. So that is the book that we're going to be utilizing for this course. And when as you're working with it, keep in the back of your mind that this book, as with so many other books that deal with military history, particularly military history in global perspective, this book is in conversation, whether it says so explicitly or not, with Victor Davis Hanson's Carnage and Culture. We'll leave it there, and then we'll move on to the next lecture. Okay, take care.